there are different ways of looking at things, and it's really up to us as individuals to interpret what we receive and to put it into action. So we have different teachings, and we'll be sharing those teachings with you. It doesn't represent the teachings of every single Indigenous person. We're going to discuss some key terms. Then we're going to do a little bit of reflecting. Then we're going to get into the Indigenous pedagogies and way of knowing. We're just going to touch on a few topics. There's just so many. It would take days to try and go through all of them, if not years. But we've selected a few here that are relevant to teaching and learning, and we will go through those, then go back down to some reflections, and then share some resources with you. The way that I like to see this is that when I think about my Indigenous culture and the ways of knowing and how everything fits together, I view it very much like a spider web, which is, not just beautiful, but you have all of these pillars that hold it together. And when you remove one, you start to destroy other aspects of it. So whereas in Western thought, things are very much compartmentalized and you don't quite mix them together, with Indigenous pedagogies and ways of knowing, they are all creating this beautiful web. So when you remove something, let's say like language, you've removed a pillar, and then other things start to suffer from it. So as we're going through the presentation and you're taking in this new information, we're often going to refer to other aspects because they are all connected, they are all intertwined, and you can't separate one from the other.
Thanks, Monica. Also, today we're going to be mentioning a few terms, or these are terms you might want to keep in mind throughout the presentation as well. So epistemology is how we create knowledge, the way our individual minds relate to reality and understand it. And it's a framework for how we assess what is true. The next definition or kind of term to be aware of is pedagogy, how knowledge and skills are transferred in an educational context, or it can also be the study of different methods of teaching and learning. And then indigeneity. So this term, indigeneity, has emerged to describe the state of being Indigenous or related to Indigenousness. So as Indigenous peoples, we can recognize our indigeneity or our identity as such, and Indigenousness can kind of relate to your territory, your culture, your community, or your tradition. So you'll hear that term used quite often at Queen's as well. And for further information about the definition, you can see the Office of Indigenous Initiatives website has further information about that and other common terms as well.
I thought it would be important to give the term for learning in Anishinaabe-Moan, because language is such an important part of how we learn and how we view the world and how we understand things. And if anyone here is, multilingual, you'll know that very often you'll come across a word in one language that doesn't quite translate well to a different language. So I wanted to provide the full scope of what this word means in Anishinaabe-Moan. So we have the word Gikendasoin. So in Anishinaabe, Gikendasoin refers to the Anishinaabe knowledge and way of knowing. And this isn't just the general sense of knowledge and knowing, but it includes knowledge of what are our origins, what is our way of life, our way of being, and our worldview. So knowledge and learning isn't just a generic term in Anishinaabe-Moan. It means, like a full essence of what it is to be alive, a being, where we've come from, that type of thing.
And I thought I would share the Gunyogeha or Mohawk version of the word as well. So Gadawiyansta is the term for I am learning or I am studying. You'll notice that there's the kind of the person is attached to the phrase as well. So I am learning. That would change, the pronoun would change if you're saying she is learning or he is learning, but the emphasis is on the action of that and making sure that that's kind of a relational way of gaining knowledge, right? So we wanted to share that because I think, as Monica mentioned, just how much of culture and worldview is expressed within our languages, and it's important to keep those kind of concepts in mind as well as we explore these topics that we'll be talking about today. So we do have some reflection questions. These are, at this time, we can just, I'll just say them. We'll encourage you to think about them, and then we'll come back to them at the end as well, because your perspective may shift throughout the presentation, or you might come up with some other thoughts along the way. So these are just some things to begin thinking about. So what values or beliefs do you think underlie Western approaches to teaching and learning? What values or beliefs do you observe in Indigenous educational approaches? What are the areas where conflicting views arise? And what are the areas where commonalities can occur? And then what are the benefits for all students of integrating Indigenous approaches into the curriculum? And then what are some ways you might begin to incorporate Indigenous ways of knowing into your course specifically or into your context within Queen's or beyond? So we'll revisit those, as I said, at the end and get some thoughts from you around those. So I wanted to kind of launch into some of the various approaches to ways of knowing or teaching and learning. Storytelling is a huge component of knowledge translation and knowledge transmission within Indigenous communities. Oral tradition teaches that when certain values or laws are upheld or observed, the people survive, and it really involves elders passing down those teachings to the youth and the younger generations. So it's really a relational exchange and a way of being and being together in conversation, in connection, and in sharing. And often that happens through storytelling, where our teachings, our values are kind of transmitted through those stories, and that's a great way to learn within community and within academic institutions as well. So a lot of use of personal narratives, a lot of lessons can be drawn from the sharing of those stories. And storytelling, when it's done well, I think really involves an active participation of the listeners, and it's more of a two-way exchange, and it allows for that kind of introspection and analysis too on the part of the learner. And narrative is a key pedagogy for learners of all backgrounds. Many cultures rely on storytelling as a key way to transmit culture and values. So it's a great way to connect as people and as humans, and to use that kind of the foundations of our cultures to share and learn together. And then I included a quote here too from one of my favorite authors, Thomas King. He says, "The truth about stories is that's all we are." And in his book, The Truth About Stories, he really talks about the power of storytelling in kind of knowledge transmission and how important that is to our identities as well. And then I'll talk a little bit about some common Indigenous values. There are obviously many different varieties of values within different Indigenous groups and communities, but these are some of the ones that are more common across many groups. So many groups include a values-based approach to how they teach and learn and share within their communities and beyond. And those values are often at the very core of who they are and how they learn. So some groups, such as the Anishinaabe, would use the 7 grandfather teachings in some variation or form. Sometimes you'll see slight variations of those across different communities, but these are used as a guide for living and a way of being on this earth. And the Haudenosaunee, the Six Nations Confederacy group, also have our core values and teachings too that are central to what we do and how we kind of walk about the earth and live our lives. So some that are core to the Haudenosaunee are peace, a good mind, and strength. Those are the 3 pillars of our great law of peace, and they kind of help guide our kind of actions on earth and the way that we live our lives. And then, as I mentioned, the 7 grandfather teachings in some variation or form often include respect, love, bravery, wisdom, generosity, humility, and truth. And you'll see those reflected in different ways, and there might be different versions of stories attached to those. And so that's one way that those teachings can kind of survive, is through the sharing of those values.
Another one is relationality. So the concept that we're all related, and we're related to the natural environment, the spirit world, each other. There's an emphasis on learning in relationships, so with fellow students, your teachers, families, community members, and the land. One of the ways I think this is not really a foreign concept, right, to the academic mind, because if we're thinking about how we're all related, you can think about it in terms of genetics and how evolution has occurred. And if you're thinking about, nutrient cycling, the molecules are going everywhere. So it's not too much of a stretch for the academic mind to grasp this concept of relationality. It's just really expressed in a different way. So I like this particular painting of Norville Morisseau, the shaman and the turtle. You see everything is connected. The leaves to the flowers, to the animals, to the shaman. Oh, I don't have the thing. Could you go to the next slide? Sacred and secular. So when I was talking about the spider web, it sort of leads into this. Indigenous ontologies and epistemologies are rooted in worldviews that are inclusive of both the sacred and the secular. So in my understanding of walking in both worlds, Western thought often has compartmentalized the various aspects of life. So you have, you don't mix language with, teachings, because you can teach in the various languages. You don't mix religion with science, all those types of things. But for Indigenous ways of being, spirituality is a necessary, thank you, a necessary component of learning. It doesn't mean that students need to follow or embrace a certain religious practice, but rather that spiritual development or growth is an essential part of learning. It's part of everything that we do. It's part of everyday life, and there isn't that separation. So that's a struggle that some students can get when they come into academia and they're trying to learn, and things get compartmentalized. One of the ways to look at it would be the boxes here on the left is compartmentalized, sort of the way that it is in Western thought. Whereas in Indigenous thought, I kind of view it as a basket where everything is put in together and you pull on what is needed as needed throughout the day.
And the next kind of concept to talk about is holism. You'll see it sometimes with or without the W. I think the W at the beginning really, for me, kind of denotes this understanding of holism as all parts of this whole that we talk about in many Indigenous cultures frame this in terms of these 4 areas. So these 4 interconnected dimensions of emotional, spiritual, physical, and mental ways of being. The Anishinaabe groups specifically express it visually with the medicine wheel concept. You'll see various orientations of it and different ways of expressing it, but that's a visual kind of approach that the Anishinaabe take to teaching about those areas. Haudenosaunee talk about those 4 ways of being and how important balance is in those 4 ways, but we just don't often do it visually with the medicine wheel in the same kind of way. But there's still an emphasis and a focus on connecting with and developing in all 4 of these realms, and really focusing on finding balance in our lives and in the way that we teach and learn together in those areas as well. And as Monica mentioned about spiritual elements being so important to learning and what that can mean for the experience as well. It just broadens the experience and makes it a very holistic and balanced approach of looking at the world and looking at the way that we can take in knowledge and share knowledge. So another thing to think about too is experiential learning and learning by modeling and by doing. This is a very common way of learning in Indigenous communities. Learning is very active, experiential, and done on the land. It's done by doing, so crafting, walking, working, moving, building together can be done by participating in ceremonies and different events, but really bringing everyone together on the land to do that work. And this is because a lot of Indigenous cultures draw their strength from the land and being grounded on it, as well as being connected to all of creation, relying on ancestors to guide them, creator, and different other people walking with them. So it can be other than humans, can be teachers as well. So there's a real preference for learning through observation, action, reflection, and then further action. And this approach can be greatly beneficial for all students to share and learn from direct experience. A lot of communities too would also engage in like apprenticeship type models where elders would be paired with youth or would kind of train them up with storytelling and with different approaches to the culture or different take on different roles within community, and those will be taught and passed down through generations. So that way of modeling and then learning by observing and then taking on certain tasks is very common and something that's important, I think, that we bring into kind of contexts like Queen's or post-secondary institutions where we can rely on using that kind of action-oriented or experiential learning as a way to engage students in a different way of thinking about how they're relating to the knowledge that they're learning or taking in.
I know this slide is mine because I like the slide. Learning is cyclical and reciprocal. For me, an elder brought up the hermeneutic circle to me, and it really made sense. We understand the whole better when we understand the parts that make up the whole. And the better we understand the whole, the better we understand those little parts, and the better we understand those little parts, the better we understand the larger part. So when we also think about, we can think about this holistically, right? So we're thinking about the whole. We can also think about the relationality here. So our whole is different for each individual, because we each as individuals have a different experience on this earth. We have different teachings that come to us. We learn different things. We process them in different ways. And then as we relate to each other, we are increasing our knowledge, and we're increasing our learning and view of the whole, right? So, you know, I've got 3 sort of circles here, and they are all different. The parts within them are different. The way they're processing them is different. And as we relate to each other and learn from each other, we are learning more pieces of this. So learning is always cyclical, and it's always reciprocal. We're always learning from each other. Learning, teaching, and knowledge transmission is always done in connection with others and the environment. We're not learning in a vacuum, right? We're learning on this planet. We're learning on this land. We're learning, you know, wherever we're going, and we're learning teachings from wherever we're going. So like I said earlier, I've received teachings from various treaty territories, and they've all had just very valuable and different ways of looking at things that have contributed to the unique view of the world that I now have. It's understood that we learn in relation to ourselves, grounded in a sense of personal responsibility and humility, other people, and the natural environment surrounding us. All who teach learn, and all who learn teach. So that sort of goes back to that you know, relationality and how we're learning from each other. All learners are also teachers, and there is no authoritarian approach to teaching and learning. All who learn will teach, and all who teach will learn. It's about sharing, balance, equality, strength, and vulnerability, simply being encircled together. Indigenous ways of knowing and learning are best built upon foundations of mutual respect and concepts of equality and sharing. All are given a chance to voice their opinions, and there is no judgment from others about what is said. Some Indigenous groups use a talking feather to conduct circles or meetings, so that the person with the feather is the only one who speaks, and the feather is passed off to the next person to signify that it is their turn to speak and others must listen. One of the good examples that I like to use to articulate this concept is, in Western thought, there's often this view of, you know, this authoritarian kind of hierarchical structure where the teachers or the older one is teaching by experience to the youth, and therefore the youth must just take in the information, right? If anyone here's worked or read Paulo Freire's work of Pedagogy of the Oppressed, it expresses this very well, where knowledge is sort of got this, it's sort of like a bank where you're just depositing information into their brains. But in Indigenous ways, it's not like that. It is a reciprocal learning relationship. And here's one of the ways that I view this. The way that we view the world is sort of set up in those first 7 years of life. However the world is during those first 7 years is how we've internalized, we've created our lens for how we understand the world. As we age, that lens, you know, might modify a little bit, but it's essentially still intact and it's still there. When we're teaching youth are making their lens. Now, you know, maybe we're not teaching, you know, 7-year-olds, but even throughout the teens and, you know, early adulthood, they have a much closer view of what the world is today than what the world was when we were that age. So there is so much that can be gained just from listening to what the youth have to say and how they're thinking and how they're viewing the world, because they've got a lens that is much closer to what the world actually is today, rather than the lens that we have from when we were growing up. That's just one example that I like to give to try and help conceptualize what we mean by there is value. There's always something to learn from whoever we are interacting with, and there's always something that we can teach as well. So it kind of goes back and forth. It's a very respectful relationship, and there's a lot of humility that goes into that, to know that, hey, I have much to learn. Although I have learned a lot and I do have a lot of knowledge that I can share, there's always more knowledge that someone else can provide to me, even if they're in a very different place.
Okay, so learning as a healing process. So in many Indigenous communities and groups, there's an emphasis on teaching and learning as very much being a healing process. So there might be all kinds of emotions that come up, hard conversations, but in the end, there's always that support and strength and courage and growth within the space. So many Indigenous groups believe that the best way to heal and learn is to work on ourselves, take responsibility, and really commit to our own personal growth and balance. So thinking again back to that medicine wheel and those four aspects of being: emotional, spiritual, mental, and physical, and how can we best ensure balance in our own lives in those areas. Um, and then also encouraging others within our community to do the same, to build strength and capacity, and to really work with our teachings as and our responsibilities as humans, is to be in balance and harmony with ourselves and each other and all of creation, and to think about ways that we can achieve that together in a learning environment can be a very healing process as well, and just an opportunity to share and to reflect on our growth as individuals too. I think sometimes we're so caught up in the learning that we forget to give ourselves that space and time to reflect on how it's impacting our views, how it's shifting us internally, and how it's maybe changing some perceptions that we've held on to for a long time. And so having that space and time, and thinking of learning as a healing opportunity can kind of promote that growth and that opportunity for engaging in reflection with yourself and with others. And so teaching and learning is also a very communal approach to doing things. So it's a very supportive environment, often done in circle, where there's a lot of strengthening and upholding and love that's shared within that space. And you're able to support each other and recognize quickly when additional support is needed. So sometimes I've been in circles where it's really challenging and difficult, and the conversation is very emotional, and sometimes just the support of us as humans isn't enough. So we've had to rely on elders to bring in sacred medicines. And they're pictured there. So sage, tobacco, sweetgrass, and cedar. Those can all be relied upon for their strength and their kind of wisdom, because they have their own energy. These plants and medicines have their own energy and their own spirit that they bring to the space. And it's often more calming and more healing than our energy as humans. And so in times when it's difficult to get through conversations, or emotions are high, or there's tension, bringing in those medicines with an experienced elder is a great way to kind of bring calm to that space and restore the equality and the balance within that space. Learning is also intergenerational, so many teachings being passed down through generations. Elders have often been respected and valued as wise teachers. So it's important to kind of recognize too that cycle of kind of sharing continues and goes on with people being kind of selected within communities to carry the stories. Often that was done just based on if someone expressed an interest or was particularly good at storytelling or at retaining knowledge. They could be ones that would carry on those stories and pass them down. But it's recognizing that it takes many people to kind of do that work, and that it's done in community and it's done in connection.
Place-based learning, as you can imagine, this is a very important part to Indigenous ways of being. Indigenous pedagogies connect learning to a specific place, and therefore knowledge is situated in relationship to a location, experience, or group of people. Creating opportunities to learn on the land or learn in connection to the local place is important. So like I said, earlier, the different places that I've lived and connected with those lands, I've received different teachings, and it's made up, and then we go back to the holism, and it makes up who I am as a person and what I'm able to provide to the communities that I am a part of. This is, a bit easier to do when you're teaching land-based topics like, biology, environmental science, that type of thing. But there are ways to sort of incorporate this into teaching that I believe we might have a presentation coming up, a workshop at some point for resources for the classroom that we can talk about. But yeah, it's an integral part of understanding and just getting in knowledge in general. And language also plays a factor in there, because places have names in the language of the area that is provides another dimension to the information that you're getting. I can't overstate the importance of place-based learning. And learning is authentic and reflective. Authentic, reflective, and deadline fluid assessments, when possible, work best for Indigenous ways of teaching, knowing, and learning. There needs to be plenty of time for reflection, growth, sharing, learning, and then the written or deliverable part may flow more easily from that. Allow for variety in formats of your assessments, ensuring that creativity is encouraged and choices are given when possible. This is super important. There's an excellent article that I refer to in the references that you guys will have after this presentation that discuss the difference between task orientation and time orientation. More often than not, Indigenous cultures have a task-oriented way of doing things. So what's important is the task, not the timeline. And so it takes as long as it takes to do the task well. And because of this holistic view of way of being, every task is done as perfect as it can be done. It is done well. It is given the full attention. It is given the respect that the task deserves to be given, to be done right. And so that often takes longer than what a deadline might indicate. And so having deadline fluid assessments is absolutely a really good idea, because then it gives time for someone to do the task and to focus on the task rather than focus on the time. Also, creating space for linguistic and non-linguistic expression of experience is very valuable, because very often Indigenous cultures have strong non-linguistic expression skills. So you can see this in artists, and it's a really beautiful thing. And you can see, and I've seen it firsthand in some of the courses that I've been, that you can get some really powerful and really authentic assignments and interaction with concepts when you give this room to express in ways that are not the standard that is currently used in Western science.
Yeah, that's so great, Monica, that you mentioned that. I think that is so true. Like, I teach in business, in commerce students. You wouldn't typically think of them submitting something like a song, but I have had some really creative assignments come in. One student, for example, did write a song and perform it and provide the MP3 to me. And sometimes artwork comes in, and it's really surprising and just great to witness when you do give that space and time for them to open up to different modes of creating the assignments or different ways of expressing themselves. So that's great to see. So this brings us back to kind of the reflective questions. We'll take this time to pause and open up the floor kind of to any questions or thoughts that you might have as you've been thinking through these questions or just listening to us speak on these topics. Anything that's coming up for you that you have to share with the group, or any questions for us. So I'll leave this slide up, but then I'll just invite you to type in the chat, or also just raise your hand and chat with us as well. Okay, I see Jen, you have your hand up. You can go ahead and speak.
Yeah, thank you. This has been a great presentation so far. I'm just curious if you or anyone else on this call has any suggestions in terms of my dissertation is trying to blend both Western and Indigenous ways in terms of my methodologies. And I'm finding that quite difficult in a very Western institution in the world that we're in. And I'm just wondering if you have any suggestions or recommendations in terms of how to do that. I'm hoping to use a two-eyed seeing approach to sort of bring the strengths of both Western and Indigenous ways into my work. And my work is focusing on culture, equity, and justice within professional practice and organizational development. So, and this is just me looking for some suggestions from a room full of experts. So if you have anything, I'd be really open to hear, or any resources that you might have, please point me in any directions. Thanks.
Yeah, you probably already checked out the work of Linda Two-Eye Smith. She does a great work on kind of decolonizing methodologies. So any of her books I would recommend reading. They really pick up on relying on the strengths of Western and Indigenous approaches and kind of braiding those methodologies together. I'm kind of at my early stages of graduate school work. I'm doing a PhD in cultural studies. So I'm just starting to explore those things myself as well. Monica, are you doing that with your biology PhD as well, like braiding different ways of knowing?
Yeah, although for me, I'm focusing more on sort of the Indigenous aspect of it. Yeah, if you give me a second, I can grab you a couple books and show you what I'm currently using for mine.
Or even if you afterwards, if you have my email, or I can reach out to you afterwards and we can continue this conversation. Yeah, I've looked at the Two-Eye Smith, Kovach has been a great resource for me as well. Sarah Ahmed. So yeah, but anything afterwards we can connect.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Kovach is very good. She's a good one too. This one has been useful. Kandosuin by Kathleen Obsalon has been a pretty decent book for mixing, pulling from both Western and Indigenous, but again, focusing on the Indigenous. And Sean Wilson's Research is Ceremony. That's a good one too. And there's a lot of papers too. I specifically gravitate towards ones that refer to Mino Bimadzwin and maintaining Mino Bimadzwin in research. There's some good papers out on that. But yeah, that's definitely a conversation that we could extend into email.
That would be wonderful, Miigwech.
Okay, any other thoughts or questions at this time? I think we have some in the chat. Okay, so we have one coming in. As a person with no spiritual beliefs, how do I include spirituality in my teaching? I think, yeah, that's a question that I get asked often actually, is how do I bring in that spiritual element? And for me, that could just be values, ethics, bringing in those types of things into conversation or into the teaching that you're providing is important, or having students reflect on that themselves. So what are your values? What are ways that you engage in kind of relationship building? For example, in my course, we talk a lot about relationship building and what that means. And students often have the kind of same pause. They're like, well, what, as a don't consider myself a very spiritual person, or I don't really kind of relate to a certain religion or a certain thing, but this is, and then I kind of encourage them to think about values. So what is it that you value, or what shapes your worldview, and then to think about that as a form of spirituality, because that is a really specific way of relating to the world and bringing in those concepts and those kind of values that shape and inform your identity or impact the way that you think about the world. So really unpacking that and thinking about those things and bringing that into conversation, or bringing that into assessments that you might be asking your students to provide or to work through, is important. So that's the way that I kind of approach spirituality, and including that, and just offering a lot of opportunities for reflection on that, and for students to begin thinking about it in different ways as well.
Yeah, I think at least making space for it, even though it might not be something that you feel particularly attached to, just understanding and knowing that it is there, and that some students may gravitate very strongly towards that, and allowing, respecting that presence, giving it space in, whatever it is your interactions are, whether it's discussions or whether it's assignments or whatever it is, allowing the space for that. Another way that you could think about it is sort of like a little, I guess, trick that I've been using myself in academia is replace the word prayer with reflect. So do you reflect on various things? That could be viewed as a sort of an aspect of spirituality, is when you're reflecting, you're taking time to think about things, and even people who are not spiritual can do a reflection.
Great question so far. Thank you. Any other questions or thoughts at this time? I know it's a lot to take in and sometimes questions might bubble up afterwards. And if that's the case, you can definitely reach out to Monica or myself and we can do our best to answer those as well. I will kind of push forward to the next slide just to show you what we will be providing. So there's a few references here for additional information about decolonization at Queen's. We've listed off some further reading that you can do. And then of course, our references from the presentation today. So those are all there for you to look at, and we'll provide the slides. We'll send out the slide deck for all of you. And then you'll have that to refer to as well. I'm just seeing another chat post. Yeah, that's great. Thanks for including that, Jenny. That resource is valuable too when you're thinking about kind of holistic assessments and circular rubrics for assessment as well. So thanks for including that. Barb, go ahead.
I mean, I want to incorporate these things into my courses. I am always petrified that I will, as a non-Indigenous person, kind of overstep or, I want to be authentic when I'm teaching. Can I be authentic teaching something that is not, what I am? As much as I admire and respect all of it, it's not what I am. I get, and I don't want, the last thing in the world I want to do is offend anyone who's in my class by pretending or I don't know. And I mean, I have the second layer of a problem where a lot of what I do is I teach TAs to teach the students, and then I'm putting a lot maybe sometimes on the TAs to really understand, a lot of this if they're ever going to engage with their students in the class. So I don't know. We've talked about this a lot in our department, how hesitant we are, and mostly because I don't want to do the wrong thing.
Yeah, and that's a huge concern, and I get that question a lot, like, how do I make sure I'm doing this in a good way? And I think that a lot of that involves positionality, like being open and honest with your students about where you're coming from, what your background is, and really stating that up front and saying, like, this is actually a new approach to me as well, and this is what I'm learning, and let's kind of go through this learning together, and recognizing that you'll make missteps and it won't be perfect and that you'll make mistakes, but being open with your students about that, I think is the first step to making sure that you're doing that in a good way and approaching it in a good way, and making sure that you have good sources as well to refer them to for further information, making sure that those sources are authentic Indigenous sources. As Monica alluded to too, we're going to be doing a presentation about selecting resources for the classroom. So that's kind of the next one in this series that we do. So that's worth checking out as well. And we usually do that in partnership with the library. And I would say too, if you're ever uncertain about a certain resource that you would like to use, you can always check with your subject matter librarian, and they can help guide that selection, or you can help with, and then hopefully strengthen your own knowledge as well to help with the TAs in that too. But even for TAs, I would say for them, that positionality piece really is key, is to state where you're coming from, where the knowledge is in relation to you, and why you're sharing it, and how it's important to share that, but that you're doing so from a non-Indigenous perspective. I don't know if you have any thoughts to add to that, Monica.
I would say don't be afraid to expand and look out for more resources. So like the Office of Indigenous Initiatives might be able to help a little bit as well. 4 Directions is good. Building the relationships. So it's one thing to read these sources and that type of thing and attend workshops, but building relationship with the Indigenous communities will help with that positionality, and will help give you to feel more well-rooted in the relationships that you're presenting and that positionality that you have, and exposing people to the content that you will be discussing. So it's the same as any topic, right? Whether it's biology or business or whatever, is the more you engage with that topic and the more you speak to other scientists and you speak to other business people, the more comfortable you become with the subject matter, and the more confident you become in what is appropriate and what is not appropriate, you know, where those lines are that shouldn't be crossed, that kind of thing. It's all a learning process, and so many people are learning right now, but there are a lot of resources on campus. You just got to find the one that's right for you, to help you build those connections. And I know it's just one more thing to add to the list of things that we all have on our plates. But I will say this, it is a rewarding, you know, we're going back to that holism, right, of the person. It is a very rewarding, and it's not just rewarding for your career, but for who you are as a person, is to build those relationships.
Thank you.
Thanks for the question, Barb. Any other thoughts or questions? Go ahead, Brittany.
There you go.
Yeah.
I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about land-based teaching and how professors can incorporate that into curriculum, just maybe different ideas of how that can be incorporated into the classroom, basically.
Yeah, so different ways that I've kind of managed to bring it into my teaching, which is not a very land-based course to teach in commerce, but the way that I've engaged students in that is to sometimes, when possible, if the weather's nice, take them outside and do sharing circles outside on the land, or sometimes bringing the land kind of into the classroom by doing conversations around where they come from, what land is important or meaningful to them. So I've used technology for that. There's a tool called Padlet, which allows you to have a map and you can pinpoint location on it. So I've had students kind of share about themselves in that way, in the location that means most to you, and describe that land and your connection to it. So it's a great way to kind of build community within the classroom as well. And you can engage them with technology in that way. Another thing is to have them outside of the classroom go for a walk and either take a picture or collect some kind of object that they can talk about and their connection to it, or what something they noticed on their walk and what that meant to them, and kind of infusing little activities that you can bring into the classroom space in that way is how I've managed to do it. I think, as Monica mentioned, obviously it's much easier if you're doing an environmental course or a biology course where you're naturally going to be spending more time, but there are like little ways to bring in kind of the land-based teaching to the classroom environment too.
I'll just add that sound is also part of being out on the land, right? So the idea of bringing in pictures is really great, but also video that has sound. If you want to play a local sound that you connect with the land. I mean, for me, for where I come from, loons is a very big thing. We hear them lots. So like bringing in those types of sounds as a background sound, or, you know, just anything that will help bring that feel of being out on the land.
Yeah, that's a great idea too. That's a great way to engage, is like even music or any kind of visual and audio things. I also have brought in like podcasts or just a variety of different materials to engage with. So sometimes just hearing different perspectives or hearing from land-based activities or perspectives through video or audio, as you mentioned, podcasts, interviews, things like that. It's really engaging for students and provides that way of kind of experiencing what it is to be on the land without necessarily going out if that's not an option. But we are very close to like Lake Ontario at Queen's, and there's a lot of great natural spaces around campus that we can make use of. And I think sometimes it's just getting past that like logistic piece of getting out there and moving forward with that with your students. Okay, any other questions or comments before we wrap up?
I think Brittany has another question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Kind of a comment, but just for the previous person who asked a question. I just wanted to mention that I believe at the Office of Indigenous Initiatives, you can also book time with an elder. So they have 2 elders there. And so if you are really nervous about getting started with indigenizing your class or your program, you could ask for the assistance of an elder from the Office of Initiatives, just as an additional suggestion. If it's really scary to incorporate those things yourself, then maybe that's a good starting off point, is kind of to learn from an elder and then build from that, and ask them your questions as well about appropriate ways to continue forward with this kind of incorporation of Indigenous pedagogies.
Yeah, that's a great point. Thanks for mentioning that. That is one of the resources that the Office of Indigenous Initiatives does provide, is that elders can be invited in as guests to classrooms for different kind of teachings or sharing of information and knowledge. They also have a series that they offer sometimes, like chats with the elders, and sometimes that's over lunchtime. I think that'll be starting up again soon, and you can participate those as staff or encourage your students to participate as well. And then just watching out for any events and kind of taking part in anything that you can to build that connection. And the office, I think, also keeps a list of like community partners that we've kind of partnered with before at Queen's, that might be ones to approach if you're thinking of a certain project with your students, or you're wanting to make connections locally but not sure where to get started. They can provide kind of a list of where to begin in your kind of outreach and what that can look like. So we can think about what that is and begin to build those connections, which Monica also stated how important that is, to kind of build from that, in addition to just including materials, to build connections beyond that too. And Rosie had a great suggestion too in the chat, is to speak about everyone in Canada as treaty people and our responsibilities as settlers. So to really think about what that kind of relationship means and what being a treaty person means to you, and can you think of ways that you might kind of challenge yourself to take on some of that responsibility for the teaching and learning. And maybe that just involves taking a step initially to promote your own learning, and thinking of ways that you can engage further personally, and then sharing that and passing that on to your students, or within whatever context or role that you're in as well. Okay, so not seeing any other hands or questions. There is a survey in the chat. If you could take a few minutes to complete that evaluation of how we did today to let us know, that would be great. Otherwise, we will send out the slide deck today so that you have it and have the resources that are attached. But I wanted to say thanks very much for joining us today, and we hope you found this information valuable and important, and that you'll continue on with the learning journey that you're on. So thanks for joining us.
Do you want to go to the next slide, Lindsay?